I'm going to hit record. So today's date is January 23rd, 2025, and my name is Sarah Holger. I'm here at the Wabasha Public Library in Wabasha, Minnesota, and I'm talking on the telephone to somebody that's in a different state. Could you introduce yourself and tell me where you are today?
Yes, my name's George Price. I'm here on my farm in Dixon, Montana, on the Flathead Indian Reservation in the Rocky Mountains.
Wow.
I've lived here for since 1985, so almost 40 years on this little 5-acre farm.
Oh my goodness. So, George, are you off the grid, like solar panels and all of that, or no?
No, we have the good fortune of having an electric grid that is actually operated by the Salish and Kootenai Indians of this reservation.
Oh, wow.
And they were able to purchase the power, the dam and the electric distributing facility. So, you know, as long as that's in place, you know, and everything is unpredictable with all that's going on. But anyway, we have electricity. It's a pretty solid system. It rarely goes, we rarely have any power failures or anything like that.
Okay.
So we have that, but we are still attempting to learn how to live without it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I anticipate that a time is coming where electric power will be at least intermittent, and it will ultimately fail. But anyway, it's important to us to be able to live in sync with the place that we're in, and disengage from the economic system by growing our own food and building our own infrastructure here with natural materials. So we never did get solar panels. Thought about it a few times, but in the situation we're in, it's not at the top of our list. Plus, I have some reservations about the way those things are manufactured.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
and they're intermittent also, and their shelf life is only 25 to 30 years.
Yep.
And then the prospects for recycling them are, it's just partial recycling that can be done with those. Anyway, I have a lot to say.
Another interview, another day. Well, I went onto your website because I first come across your book just doing some generic online searching of the Easton family and discovered your book, and then I started looking into you. So that brought me to the University of, were you at Missoula? Where were you teaching at?
University of Montana in Missoula. I taught there for 20 years, from 1998 to 2018 in the Native American Studies department and the History department and African American Studies.
Okay, yeah. Then I found your like personal website that has more of like a blog on there about traditional skills and living off the land. So that's where that's neat that you're still doing education, in everyday life. I'm curious. Okay, so let's start with at the very beginning. George, when and where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Okay, I was born in 1951 in Los Angeles, California, and I lived there until I was 18. And in 1970, when I was 18, I left and hitchhiked up. I was going to go to Canada and ended up in the Pacific Northwest for a while until we moved here, my wife and children and I, in 1985.
Okay.
So, yeah, we lived in Oregon most of that time.
Oh,
Barb and I got married in 1973
okay.
in Oregon.
That's a beautiful area. I have family in Oregon.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they're kind of in the Portland and then Salem area. So how did you become interested in genealogy and historic research? What brought you into that realm?
Well, I knew growing up that my family was very diverse. I had relatives with all kinds of different physical appearances, and that we didn't fit neatly into one of the mythical American racial categories. Yet, for convenience, my ancestors, parents, grandparents, but not identified as, well, it used to be called colored people, and then Negroes became a name, and then black in the 1960s, and I always questioned that whole identity system, that you could take all of the broad span of human diversity and put it into four nice little neat categories.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, that brought me into studying history and sociology, and but I dropped out of college when I was 18 before I got on the road, and then when I came back to college after we had our third kid in 1977, I resumed those studies formally, and then when I became a teacher, I was actually an art teacher, and then I started teaching history along with that in a high school here on the reservation, and being part of this Native community got me to want to find out about my own Native ancestors, because there was never much talk about them. It was just kind of knew where they were there somewhere in the past, and my grandmother was the only one who even went back to Massachusetts to visit her Easton relatives who were Wampanoag and African mix there. So she was the only one still in touch. We never really talked about the tribal aspect of their culture or anything, just these are my cousins and these are their names. It was like, I got a letter from this cousin, and there was never any indigenous identity discussed in my family growing up. So I wanted to kind of unlock all of that missing information about the family, and from doing that, I discovered who the Eastons were in history, and it was like I think this is the answer to one of your questions. I didn't get those questions printed out. You were about I was about 5 minutes behind being ready.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm counting on you to remind me of the questions and don't let me wander too far. But one of the questions was related to why he started studying this history, and then you had another questions about who the Eastons were in history. I'll just take it in the order you want to.
Sounds good. Well, you know what? I'm going to be honest. I did not realize you were a descendant of the Eastons because I haven't read your book yet. So I just thought you were a scholar who chose that family. I didn't really know why. So I'm learning a lot already.
Hey, I'm glad we got that out there for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, I think the question was focusing on the Easton family, when and how you first discovered you were, or you discovered the family. So I mean, did you grow up knowing the Eastons were your ancestors? I mean, when did you first really start diving into that?
Okay, yeah, the last chapter of the book is on my great-grandfather, William Easton, and so I knew a lot about him. In his books I had. So it was just a matter of connecting him to his ancestors. And then when I began to do that, I found out about their abolitionist connections and involvement. And then when I went further back, when they were still living on an Indian reservation in Massachusetts, I found out about their battle with their neighbors to keep their lands, and how the Eastons were involved in a big court battle on behalf of their tribe. All of this that I found out was over a long period of time of research. I began about 1986 and didn't get the dissertation finished until 2006. So
wow,
that's 20 years of research, and then more information came to me after the dissertation was done, and then I turned that into the book in 2020.
Okay.
When I finally had time to do something like that.
Right? Oh my goodness. Yeah, I mean, how amazing to be able to take your professional career and focus on history that directly relates to your family. Like I would love to be able to find a way to work in my work researching my family roots, because we discovered just through DNA tests that we are related. Like what showed up just on a recent DNA test, I don't know if you've done the DNA stuff, but 23andMe, I did 23andMe and Ancestry, both of them, and they update the genetic information every year, like once a year. And the newest updates I just received like a month ago. It said that, and I knew I had African ancestry. It's like 0.2%. It's very small, but they were able to pinpoint part of the African diaspora. I don't understand any of this. I'm just learning, specifically to like Virginia, North Carolina region, and a certain time period. So now I have some work to do to figure out where that comes into my family line. And I wish I could get paid to do that research.
Yeah, you mean, because, I had plenty of other things I had to do. My primary teaching area was in Native American Studies, and I taught the broad survey course, the Intro to Native Studies, and so I had to know a little bit of everything, and always focus on what was most interesting to me. But anyway, I'm glad I did that, though,
right,
because it really helped me to make significant theoretical and intellectual connections across the spectrum of Native America. So that's good. Big picture stuff is important, and most people are forced into narrow specialization, and so they miss a lot of the big picture.
For sure.
Yeah.
So if we look at the Easton family, and I know you wrote a whole book on this, and we can share more in the like where people can find that book. But to kind of, and we only have an hour to interview. So like, what if you want to sum up the story of the Easton family, which I'm sure is difficult? Like where do you want to start this story? I mean, they're indigenous, so that goes back thousands of years. But what can you tell me about the Eastons, like where they kind of originate from in America, where they lived, and then their migration kind of, because some of them did migrate to Minnesota. And I know that's not what you focused your book on, but more of their origin story. What can you share about that?
Fine, yeah, I can do the short version. I've had practice at this. It's not always easy, like you said. Anyway, back around, it's within 10 to 15 years after the Pilgrims from England came to Massachusetts, Africans were brought in. And interestingly enough, one of the leading groups in the transatlantic slave trade at that time were the Quakers, who became later one of the leading anti-slavery churches.
Yeah.
And so there's quite a story there with the evolution of the Quakers' belief systems. But during that time, in the late 1600s, let's say, I traced back my family to one of the leading families of Quakers at Newport, Rhode Island, the Eastons. Actually, governor, a couple of people were the governors of the colony, the Eastons. Anyway, that's where the family name got adopted from my indigenous and African ancestors. And the Eastons had both native and African slaves, and then some of the identities aren't even named in their notes and in the will. But anyway, I know those were my ancestors, some of those servants of the Eastons, and that they left there when they were freed after the Quakers at least those Quakers had turned against slavery. And in the 1690s, and then they went and joined up with their Wampanoag relatives in first a place called Little Compton, Rhode Island, and then Titicut, which is the one I write about in the book, which was actually the second Indian reservation in Massachusetts history. He gave up that system later. But anyway, the short story, again, is, there is always a humanitarian and liberal or libertarian, actually, impulse in that early and late colonial history, part of the Great Awakening in the churches, and then of course, the big intellectual movement of the time. I can't. Sometimes words leave me.
It's okay. I understand.
3 years old, and but the Enlightenment. I'm so sorry, I forgot that word. But so that era, there was a lot of talk, at least, about liberty and equality, and both. It was a very multiracial movement when you combined Enlightenment, rational arguments for liberty and equality with liberty and equality in the church during that Great Awakening. So the various churches. And so my ancestors, who once most of their lands were taken, they had to live in towns and cities with the white majority, and in their churches and all of that. And so that's how they all got together, and with Quakers and other white abolitionists, they all participated in this movement. There's a lot of interesting characters. You can read about them in the book. I won't go into all of them. So just in summary, soon after that Great Awakening period and during the Enlightenment, the American Revolution breaks out. And a lot of people seem to think the American Revolution started just in the few years before 1776, but there were revolutionary movement calls for it back in the 1750s, and amongst all people, working class and oppressed people, especially in New England and in the other colonies too. So a lot of the story of the book is about an intersection of idealists going across racial lines, including intermarriages and all kinds of stories there. And you mentioned Virginia. The reason so many people, including people who now are identified as white but had some African ancestry, is Virginia had by far the most enslaved Africans there during that era, the whole era of slavery. And so lots of people have their roots there, including some of my other family members. But anyway, so this movement took off really strongly by the 1820s. I would say, during and after the Revolution, there was a hope that it would end slavery, and most of the original 13 states did end slavery in their state constitutions right after the Revolution. 8 out of the 13 colonies, and then a couple of them ended slavery later. New York being one of the last of the northern. A lot of people don't understand that, because they don't teach us in the school systems. All 13 colonies and 13 original states at the time of the Revolution had slavery. It wasn't just a southern thing. It predominated in the southern agricultural systems, but the wealthy northerners had enslaved people working in their houses and mansions and in their shops and businesses and doing manual labor all over the towns in the north. And so the prevailing sentiment, which is very understandable if you read Enlightenment era writings, and Tom Paine being one of the leading American Revolution ideologues, and also one of the leading anti-slavery advocates of his time, there was a very strong sense that the Constitution of the United States should outlaw slavery. But the wealthy Virginia aristocrats and some from the Carolinas and a few other places overruled them at the Constitutional Convention. So I don't want to go into all of that history now. It's a fascinating history. I go further in the book, but if the majority had their way at the Constitutional Convention, slavery would have ended right then.
Oh, wow.
The short story. And, of course, that's not taught.
Right.
They, of course, wanted to normalize what those Virginia aristocrats who became the majority of the presidents early on in the nation, they wanted to justify and normalize their slaveholding, right, as part of idealizing these central characters. But anyway, so my family and many others in early Massachusetts history and in other places as well were part of this movement to end that. And it was a very integrated movement, and that's another thing that doesn't often get told. And so when I talk about my motivation to research and study all of this, I had this very strong drive that came from feeling that I personally was robbed of all these stories by an education system, from kindergarten through grad school. I mean, the whole system that wanted to protect the status quo power structure. So that sense of injustice really drove me to do this research. And at that time, I was doing this the bulk of my research before 2006. Computers and the internet didn't come in till maybe the last 5 or 8 or so years of that. Just a little bit at a time. So I was having to scrape up travel money to go to libraries all over Massachusetts from my home here in the Rocky Mountains and Washington, D.C. to the Archives, National Archives, Library of Congress. Everywhere I could find the information that I was looking for.
Wow, that's a lot of work.
Yeah, that's why I have, thousands and thousands of handwritten notes that I've never really cataloged or really thoroughly organized. They're in separate files that have names on them and labels. But when you're taking notes on one person in one document that you've been trying to learn about, then you see the names of some other people you were studying. And so you have these pages of notes with several different figures on them that you want to put in files. And so you got to say, well, which file should I put this one in?
Right.
It's got 3 or 4 different stories going on here. So anyway, I really need a full-time secretary. I've been saying that for many years. Like a librarian. Wouldn't it be cool to have a librarian who came here for a few months as an intern and organized all my notes?
Yes.
Okay, I digress. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I totally understand. Well, as we think about the Easton family, and we're getting into the 18, what do we say here? 1820s, and things are really starting to heat up with the abolitionism. I'm curious about, like, what religion did they affiliate with? a religious organization? Was there a certain profession they tended to be drawn towards? Are there any commonalities you see among these Eastons, especially the Eastons who are civically active in like abolition work?
Yes. So they were all Christians, and a lot of the native people at that time, adapted Christianity. At first it was kind of an add-on to their own spirituality, but eventually it became necessary as a safety measure to go to the churches and identify as Christian when you had to live there in the towns with the English. And, before the American Revolution, they were the English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, anyway, so that carries over into post-revolution times. By that time, when slavery ended in Massachusetts in 1781, there's a big influx of people of color, both formerly enslaved and some of them were indentured servants too, into the towns and into the churches, and that leads to one of the big stories of the book as far as church involvement goes. They had to deal with segregated seating arrangements and second-class treatment within the Christian churches, and specific churches that are mentioned as that they were part of, and they did the first sit-in protests that I've been able to find, or anybody that I know of has been able to find in American history. The first sit-in protests were in the churches against the segregated seating.
Wow.
It began in the 1780s, and the Eastons were at the forefront of that. And first it was in the Congregationalist church there in North Bridgewater, Massachusetts, which is now called Brockton, Mass. So several protests there, but they were members of that church. And then after meeting a certain amount of adversity, they went over to the Baptist church in the neighboring town of Stoughton, and were accepted into that church, but sooner or later had to deal with calls for segregated seating arrangements. Again, the American racial norms and racist structures were taking hold. So during the time that the abolitionist and anti-slavery movement was growing, there is this counter movement, of course, to a pro-slavery and a pro-white supremacy movement, which, ultimately led to the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of this was long in development. The Civil War didn't just pop up in the 1850s and 60s there. It was a long division. And, of course, there's so many correlating elements here with our recent history. It's just incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Racist power structures were not accidents, people worked very hard to preserve dominance and preeminence in society. Once they had that, it's such a valuable tool in a capitalist, very ultra-competitive and colonialist structure. So they didn't want to give that up too easy. And so the people who resisted that were often persecuted. And, here's another point, when you talk about this division and the polar opposites. And I'm saying today, you have a very broad spectrum of beliefs and attitudes in between the extremes. And so that's why you had these interracial alliances. When they voted in the churches, I found in the church records, the decision to have separate seating for the people of color was not a unanimous decision. And it came up for a vote over and over again. And that's in the book. But, you had white folks there. They were the majority in the urban centers and the churches. And so you had anti-slavery, pro-equality white folks who had to be careful, but they felt morally, and I'd say some of them, spiritually or religiously compelled to speak out against the injustice. So, the abolitionists were not as unique as some people claim. They weren't such an oddball group, as whenever they do get mentioned in school curriculum in America, it's like, oh, here's a very exceptional, odd group of people. They're actually anti-slavery. But everybody else was okay with it. That's kind of the implication you get with the way it's taught.
Yeah.
The way it's taught, and also how much is omitted by it. Students learn a lot by what is omitted.
Yeah.
That's how norms are preserved and all that. And so you had people in these churches who weren't necessarily abolitionists. Some of them were, but they were just Christians who thought that's wrong, making some of our brothers and sisters have to go sit in separate pews, and they also had to be the last in the church to take communion.
Yeah.
And so that wasn't just the Congregationalists or the Baptists. It was in many American churches at that time. And not everybody accepted that. And of course, it led to a lot of conflict, and a lot of people had to hide their feelings too. It wasn't safe to be pro-equality everywhere, and this is even in the so-called free North, which gets off the hook so much the way slavery and racism is taught in the schools is just being a Southern thing for the most part,
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope I answered a question there.
Yeah.
At least one here.
Yeah, that was looking at churches. And then if we think about like their professions or their trades, was there a trade skill that you tend to notice like a lot of the Eastons carried on, or not necessarily?
Yes, yeah, including there in Minnesota, so that'll connect us to them. So when James H. Easton first got to Minnesota, for a time there he carried on his old profession of shoemaking. So his grandfather, James Easton, and I forgot to mention his Revolutionary War service and the fact that in Massachusetts, at one point during the American Revolution, nearly half of the Revolutionary soldiers were people of color. And a lot of testimony to that, and you can find the records, and I refer to them. But so you had Afro-Native and mixed people, including James Easton. So coming out of the Revolution, he learned a skill of blacksmithing, operating iron foundries and doing iron work, and that became his primary trade, and he went into business for himself on the Easton family farm there in North Bridgewater, and eventually they expanded into shoemaking as well. So they grew their own food. They did all kinds of smelting and manufacturing of iron tools. They did some tin smithing as well, but mostly iron. And then by the 1830s, there were a couple of inventions. One was invented by an African American that helped speed up the process for shoemaking. Anyway, and they took up shoemaking as well. And so when the grandson of James Easton, the Revolutionary War soldier, his grandson eventually immigrated to Minnesota. Well, he first started doing shoemaking. It says on the census record there in 1860 that he was a shoemaker and that his wife was an artist. It says on that record. So that what I sent you yesterday, that husband and wife ran a photography studio in Rochester.
Yes.
That had to have developed sometime during or at the end of the 1860s, possibly 1870, right around in there. And so I believe from just that little bit that I have that Lucy, his wife, was a photographer originally. And then he joined her in that business. And they did pretty well. And I'm hoping I will get to learn much more about all of that from you. And I was going to recommend to you that you look at the city directories of Rochester, Minnesota from, I'd say late 1860s on through the rest of that century. And you'll find their business there and see some information about, for one thing, how long did they continue in that business. Now, the book excerpt that I sent you yesterday, sorry I forgot to do the attachment when I first told you about it. That's just another one of my disabilities these
It's
days.
okay.
Anyway, but that chapter of the book only focuses on the women photographers, so they didn't really go into James too much, but it's more about his wife. And very interesting person. So I think you'll be able to find out a lot more. You'll be able to find the location of their studio, how long they stayed in business, and maybe that'll lead you to other connections regarding their anti-slavery work. Now, of course, by 1865, which would have been probably shortly after they arrived, slavery was officially ended, and the Underground Railroad kind of folded, except in some cases where former slaves were not very welcome.
Oh, sure.
In free society, and even in the free North, and they heard from relatives who were already in Canada, including some of the Talbots. That family of relations of ours ended up in Canada, and some of them are still there today. And one of them does family history, so I was able to learn a bit from him years ago. I don't know if that fellow's still around. But anyway, some of them went to Canada just because they were treated better there. And then many, here's another Underground Railroad story that doesn't often get told is, after being enslaved in the very hot and sweaty South, and also coming from a tropical climate in Africa, a lot of people had a hard time adjusting to the cold up in Canada after escape through the Underground Railroad. So when slavery finally ended, and in some cases even before it ended, during the Civil War, a lot of them came back, and you don't hear too much talk about the reversing of the Underground Railroad and coming back and all that, but many did, and many also didn't want to stay in the cold north, and they went to some of the southern border states, and then many of them ended up going out west.
Sure.
With the wagon trains and the Buffalo Soldiers. That was an opportunity to escape from both the southern and northern racism, and get a good employment working for the Army, and I have a lot I could tell you about the Buffalo Soldiers, but that's not on our topic right now.
There's so much here. I know, it's fascinating, this whole subject. I'm going to focus it back to the Easton family in the 1820s. So I created like a family tree on Ancestry, and I'm not a historian by any means. I got sucked into this research in a very serendipitous way, but I'm not a historian by training. I'm a naturalist, so I've worked for Minnesota State Parks, and I've teach about people's connection to nature and the land. So there's a human, there's a human element to that. But as far as being a trained historian, I don't have like research skills that I probably should have. So I'm on Ancestry, but I can almost guarantee you my tree that I created probably has a lot of errors in it. But the Easton family, that are the children of James Easton and Sarah Dunbar Easton. There's a bunch of them here, but I'm just curious because, so like Hosea Easton was a reverend, and he ends up out in Connecticut. And was he a musician? There's somewhere where there's like a banjo player that comes in. It was his son, maybe. That was his
grandson became a minstrel, and that's a whole long history. But he ended up in Australia. His minstrel group of African American musicians ended up in Australia and toured New Zealand and all over Australia. And he lived there until he died. He's a banjo player. I actually have a photograph of that particular Hosea Easton in the book.
Okay.
So he was of the later generation, grandson of the very well-known abolitionist Hosea Easton. So I co-wrote a book on Hosea before I did my book on the larger family. So that's out there too. But my second book is much more thorough on all of that. So.
Well, this Hosea Easton, the senior, the older one, he was a reverend, it says?
Yes, that's where he's going. He was in one of the early black denominations, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And there were a few different denominations that sprung up as a response to that kind of treatment I told you they had received in the white churches Some of them just felt, we don't want to deal with that anymore. We'll form our own churches and denominations. And so out of the black churches, and here again, history repeats itself. You saw this same development in the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement. A lot of that was led by reverends in the black churches, like the King being the best known, but there's so many others too. And so that was what happened in the 50s and 60s as a repeat of how when the black churches first were formed there in the 18 teens and 20s and 30s, they just kind of naturally were called upon to defend their people from racism. And even though many of those African and Afro-mixed people in the North had never really been in slavery, by that time, the 20s and 30s, a lot of them were born free. And even so, they recognized that the very existence of slavery, wherever it still existed, mostly in the South, was a hindrance to them and tainted the entire society and demeaned them as people. And so they worked against racial discrimination in the North, but also became very much leading figures, many of them, in the abolitionist movement, working with people like William Lloyd Garrison and his newspaper, The Liberator. When Garrison first launched that newspaper in 1831, the vast majority of his subscribers were free people of color there in the North. They kind of helped him stay afloat, because it wasn't very popular to have such a radical newspaper in New England society at that time. And so it was the middle class, working class, free people of color in the North. One very wealthy free African American veteran of the Revolution in Philadelphia named, here I go again with names. His first name was James too, but not Easton. It was a different guy. Okay, I'll come back to him. But he was a philanthropist. He was actually one of the wealthiest. Forten, James Forten, Forten, was one of the wealthiest men of any color in Philadelphia at the turn of the 19th century, around 1800, till he died in around 1840. He died, I think. Anyway, he was one of the big funder persons for the whole abolitionist movement. Of course, he doesn't make it to your mainstream history books.
Right.
Even though he's part of the Revolutionary Army when he was just 13 years old, he had been taken prisoner, just like James Easton also was in a British prison fort as a revolutionary soldier. So, there are more untold, really important stories of American history than there are stories that are actually told and published in our schools.
For sure. And I mean, our local history centers in Minnesota, the county history centers, are, they're trying to work with researchers and folks that have been, digging these stories up for decades now to kind of make sure that the stories being told in these county history centers are more, you know what I'm saying, more truthful, because they've been whitewashed. So I've had, every time I go into a history center to do this research, they're very curious about what I'm finding, what I'm looking at, because they would, you know, they'd like to be able to find ways to share these stories. And we have a whole movement of folks in Minnesota led by multiracial, you know, descendants of formerly enslaved people going back to the East Coast that are, you know, working together. Where there's a whole network of us. We meet every other month, and we're trying to figure out how to archive this research that we've been doing, because many of us are doing it on our own. We're not doing it through colleges or through, you know, any county historical societies. And so how can we archive this and make sure it's accessible for free? Because that's another thing that's difficult, is when you have to pay to go into all these history centers and pay. I was at the History Center in Olmsted County in Rochester here a couple weeks ago looking for James Easton's photography records, because there are some photos that they have archived there that he took in his photography shop. And I had to pay. I mean, I was able to look at them for free, but anything I wanted to make a copy of, even if it was on my own phone taking pictures, I had to pay $1 per photo. I was like, that's ridiculous. I mean, I get it. They need to make a revenue to keep their centers open, but if you're trying to research this aspect of history that's fallen through the cracks because it was either purposely kept quiet or it's just been buried, they should make it really accessible, and they should be helpful in trying to find that information. So we're trying to figure out how can we archive this in a place that's going to be free and accessible to everybody, and that's a challenge.
Yeah, and there has been a trend to digitize these records, but it seems to be kind of slow going, because I remember when one of my friends at the Massachusetts Historic Genealogical Society was first on that back in the late the late 1990s and the early 2000s. You know, it kind of gave me a hope that everybody is going to do that soon, but it's been kind of slow going, because these research libraries, you know, make a lot of their income off of charging fees and having everything limited access like that,
right?
Or paid.
Yeah, I feel like. Well, I was wondering if there's a way they could create policies where it's like, if you're researching it for, you know, thesis work or for writing a book, then there's maybe a fee. But if you're like, if it's nonprofit, if it's whatever, then it's like that's free. I don't know if there's a way they could have like a sliding scale or something. I don't know.
They could, but you know, power structures being what they are,
right?
People guarding positions in this kind of a society. You know, it's just kind of not favored by the people at the top usually. Now you see all kinds of exceptions to this, but academia's partly to blame, because the social hierarchy there, that you know, people guard their turf, and you know, they're not sure if they are prominent in these institutions. They want everybody to notice that, and everybody to defer to them and apply a special honor to them for that as well. You know, there was a lot about living in academia that I found distasteful during my 25 years, if you include my time as a grad student and then teaching there 20 years. But anyway, it was just you know, very revealing. I'll say I did learn a lot observing these social games that people were playing.
Yeah, I can imagine. I worked for 25 years for the state of Minnesota, for the Department the Department of Natural Resources. And just a lot of bureaucracy and, like you said, kind of power seem like power struggles almost. So I understand, and I'm sure it's even worse in the academic field. But to bring it back to the interview here, because I'm going to keep going on a tangent if I don't focus on the interview. So we have Hosea Easton, the Reverend, who was a well-known abolitionist. Are there other Eastons that pop out when you think of like anti-slavery work? Other names?
Yes. Well, so Hosea's brother, Joshua, who the other Joshua is probably named after, was one of the original founding members of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society.
Oh.
And then Hosea joined soon after, around the same time. Their brother James Jr. was always an activist too. Their sister Sarah, named after their mom, married a significant and a very colorful Afro-American activist named Robert Roberts, and their son, one of their 12 children, Benjamin Roberts. I do a chapter on him in the book because he is famous as the leader of the movement to integrate the schools in Boston and do away with separate schools for the children of color. And so it was the Massachusetts Supreme Court case, Roberts versus the City of Boston, pretty well-known case that was cited. Some of the arguments in that case were cited in the 1954 Brown versus the Kansas Board of Education case that integrated all the schools in the U.S. So this grandson of James Easton, cousin of Hosea and the other guys, he was very significant and very interesting, a real fighter, and that story has all kinds of other complex connections too. But anyway, his father, Robert Roberts, interestingly, was enslaved. Unlike all the Eastons who were born in freedom after the 1690s, when the Quakers owned them and set them free. So they didn't really know slavery firsthand, but their James and Sarah's daughter, Sarah, married a Carolina former slave who was a butler and a house servant there. And when he came to the north, it was because the governor of Massachusetts needed a butler. And a lot of these northern slave-owning aristocrats had good friends in Virginia and in the South and the power structure elite world. And so one of them purchased Robert Roberts from somebody in South Carolina. But when he brought him back to Massachusetts, because by then slavery was over in Massachusetts, it was illegal, he just became a butler, a servant. Anyway, so this guy, Robert Roberts, was authored the first nonfiction, actually helpful guide type of book in the United States by a person of color. It's called The House Servants Directory. And it was not directory in the sense that we think of like a phone book or city directory. It was direction. So it was advice on how to be a very good successful butler. Now, you might think, well, that's not a pretty high bar for aspirations in life, but a butler in that elite class, especially a free person in the North, could do very well for himself, as Robert said. He had very good pay, and when he was set free, actually he was free, but he was released. They had this agreement. He would work for the governor, Christopher Gore, who was his name, and I believe it was close to the time of the death of Gore. Roberts wanted to go off and do something different than butlering, He wanted to have more time to work in the abolitionist movement. And so he was given a large sum of money. I don't know how much, but it was enough so that he eventually he bought 2 houses for him and his family.
Wow.
In Boston, nice places, and he bought some land from James Easton, his father-in-law, over in North Bridgewater. James Easton had a pretty large piece of land there right in town, but it was, like I said, farmland and factory mixed. And so the other thing about James Easton's farm, there was also a school to teach the trades to the young men.
Huh.
Blacksmithing, shoemaking, and farming. And so that was a part of it. So, Robert's quite a character. Unfortunately, he's also a womanizer who got caught committing bigamy twice. Married women while he was still married. After his second wife, Sarah Easton, Roberts, she died, and then he kind of went nuts as far as his involvement with different women, including, of course, Anna Easton. Okay, you might not have known this actually. So after Anna, who went to Massachusetts with her sons, after her husband, their father, James Easton Jr., died in 1838 is when he died. 5 years later, Robert Roberts, who actually was still married to another woman after his wife Sarah had died, married Anna, and she only found out like a few years later that he was still legally married to another woman.
Oh my goodness.
So I found this in the North Bridgewater Gazette, the leading newspaper there at the time, and the citation is in the book 1851, that she took him to court. She said, mainly to repair her reputation, which had been shattered, not just because she was a white woman who married into this family of color, mixed Afro-Native family, who were also already mixed with white through the Dunbars, and the other ancestors, and so that wasn't as big of a scandal as being part of a marriage of bigamy.
Oh, right? Oh my goodness. Well, I got a question about that. If that was 1851, you said, when that court case was?
Yeah.
Well, she comes to Minnesota, James and Joshua, her sons, come, I think in 1857, they show up on that census. So they were here like right with the earliest of settlers in Winona County. And they had like a hotel that they started. It was short-lived, but they had a hotel too. And so then Anna shows up, I think, on the 1860 census. I don't remember. She's here just for a little bit, like you said, and then she ends up going back to Massachusetts where she's buried. But it makes you wonder if she wasn't escaping that stigma of that bigamy situation. I don't know.
I think she was, because in the court records, she talks about the shame that had been brought on her. Really, it was the shame should all have been on Robert Roberts,
Right.
because he had hidden that fact from her, or just kind of disregarded it.
Yeah.
And then later on, after that, he commits. He gets married to another white woman and commits another bigamy situation with this really young gold digger gal, because he is a pretty wealthy guy, like I said, in the court records, the last wife of Robert says in court, "Yeah, I knew he was married, but I didn't care because he gave me such nice and pretty things."
Oh my goodness. Oh man. Oh my goodness.
Like Esther too, or something. But anyway, when you go into being a historian and looking up all these old stories, you don't know how much fun you might have. Sometimes it was pretty tedious, and not very exciting. But you run into stories like that too, and I got other stories, when you talk about the Boston school integration movement. Not all of the people of color were in favor of sending their kids to integrated schools with the white public schools, and they liked having their separate school. And so that brings up this other issue of black separatism that reoccurred in the late 1960s, and after the civil rights movement in several places, there were some radical black nationalists, but you also had people not so radical, but not so crazy about integration either.
Sure.
Well, there was a precedent for that there in Boston in the 1840s there when, and this, there's so many stories, you got to tell me when to stop, but right there in the family, there were differences of opinion. So Benjamin Roberts was like this zealous, uncompromising advocate for integration, and his brother, John H. Roberts, was part of the faction that said, well, wait a minute, not so fast. We still want to keep our black grade school for those who aren't comfortable being underdogs in the white schools,
Sure.
and being mistreated there. A very similar argument than as to the argument for black churches,
Yeah. Yeah, I can sympathize with that.
Yeah, so very interesting, complex history. And so in that story of the factionalism over school integration, you even get into a violent fight and attack that occurred. And Benjamin Roberts was right in the thick of that. And his brother was friends with the pro-black school people who got attacked. So there is a lot of, I guess, social complexity that often gets ignored because of the tendency to want to make nice, neat, clean divisions between people in history,
Sure.
not just the racial ones, but the ideological ones. It's hard for a lot of people to accept complexity or subtlety. That's unfortunately that's the way the world is, though. There's a whole spectrum of beliefs and ideals in any one given society.
Yeah. Well, going back to the Easton family, would it be fair to say the generation of that Reverend Hosea and the first Joshua and first James, that generation, that they were almost all, if not all, involved in some sort of civil rights, anti-slavery, abolitionism work?
Yes, they were. I think you had a few exceptions. It was a big family.
Yeah.
Right? So not everybody was a zealot or almost full-time activist like Hosea. And so some of them just stayed on the farm and did normal farm stuff and tried to run their business. But when their business was persecuted because they were so successful, probably, and they developed a lot of animosity and envy because there were many iron workers and foundries and forges, as they called them, throughout New England. But in that one part of Massachusetts, that was one of the primary occupations. And not everybody played by the rules, as you discover when you look at these court cases. They were brought into court many times, usually accusations of debt. And sometimes it was true, and sometimes there were falsifications, and usually those cases got dropped without a verdict and settled out of court and all that. But, in colonial and early U.S. society, the number one reason that people got called into court was debt.
Interesting.
Long before credit cards or any of that kind of stuff, people were in debt to other individuals. And that's there was kind of an informal credit system, kind of like people who have a tab at a bar or something like that. If they know you well, you can go in there and say, "Put it on my tab."
Right.
And buying supplies for your iron business and whatnot and things like that. Some people knew each other well enough to be able to charge it in that sense,
Yeah.
They wouldn't come into court until somebody had been offended, usually, or, a fight had broken out, and it was, okay, I'm going to call in your debt. And even though they could show them that in a written agreement that they had this certain amount of time to pay off the debt, people would get mad and say, I'm calling it in right now. And that's many of the court cases. I was looking mostly in the Plymouth County court records for that era, but also Bristol County, the next county to the west of them. Plenty of cases like that too. And more often than not, this was, white people charging other white folks. I mean, it wasn't all race-based or racist stuff. For the Eastons, there is that racial element too.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that with mortgages too, where at least here in Minnesota, in the very earliest of days, there's a lot of in the early newspapers where it's people being brought to court because they couldn't pay their mortgage. It's amazing how quickly it seems people want to steal land from other people as quick as they can.
That might have been the most common form of indebtedness because nobody really, even to not this day and not then either, had the funds to buy a piece of property outright.
Yeah.
For a little humble dwelling somewhere on 1 acre or something like that. But, so yes, mortgages, land and house debt were probably the most common. And then just various kinds of personal loans from one person to another. That was another really common form of debt. You didn't see bank loans so much. That was pretty much reserved to the upper class. They could go into debt to banks much more often than a poor person, or even just a working class person. The banks wouldn't deal with them. That's people of all colors,
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a much more elite institution in those days.
So I'm going to take a peek back at Anna Keith Easton. So she was first married to this Keith guy, who sounds like a real, not a maybe a nice person, I guess. I don't know.
I don't know much about him, but I did when I was looking through my notes last night. I noticed that the Talberts, who had various spellings and pronunciations of their last name, Talbot, Tarbet. Anyway, they were at one time enslaved by some of the Keith family there in Bridgewater back before the Revolution in 1750s. There is a Toby Talbot who was kind of a very well-known figure who also served during the entire American Revolution. That was another thing about the soldiers and sailors, too, of color during the Revolution. They would serve for much longer times of enlistment than a lot of the white farmer working class guys who would have to leave to go back and tend to their crops or whatever, or just were terrorized by the war, and left on their own.
Yeah.
And at times of enlistment, and you can see this in the Massachusetts soldiers and sailors records of the Revolution. It gives you time served for each individual soldier, and I notice a lot of the ones who didn't have color designated for them were serving 3-4 months, whereas a lot of the ones that I recognized as people of color, they didn't always label them that way, except on the sailors list. They did have a descriptive list, and then the soldiers list sometimes had descriptions like skin color, dark hair, woolly. Well, okay, I get that racial categorization, and they would often serve for years, and you had several, not that many, but several cases where they served all 8 years of the Revolution.
Wow. Yeah, that Talbot, I did come across, and that was just early this morning, that Toby Talbot, because it talked about like one of the earliest incidences of the Underground Railroad in Massachusetts is linked to him, and Him trying to escape from his enslaver, who was a Keith, and what was it? His wife was enslaved somewhere else, and he basically took her from the farm or plantation she was on, and they ran into the swamps, and they lived in the swamps for years and years. And they were aided by like locals who helped them kind of escape from slave hunters and stuff. So I don't know how there. It sounds like it's kind of folklore, but there's supposedly some historical marker or something at that swamp still today. So it's interesting.
Now I wonder if there's more than one Toby. Do you know what year that was?
Oh, let's see here. I did write that down. That was early, though, so that might be a different Toby Talbot. Maybe you have a descendant of his, because I think they said he arrived really early in the... Because Reverend James Keith was his enslaver, and this Toby Talbot came directly from Africa. Shoot, I don't have his birth date.
He comes into the records in the 1750s as far as my notes go, and I can look it up. I got a bunch of disorganized papers in my lap here, but in 1755, Toby was enslaved by the widow of, I guess, of that man you mentioned.
Yeah, this is Lydia Keith.
Lydia?
Yeah. She's the widow?
In 1755.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, Toby early on, he was enslaved, but he also, he was freed, I think, during the time of his service in the American Revolution, either just before or just after he was freed, and then, Massachusetts ended slavery in their state constitution, the first state constitution. Well, because he was free, but still being treated by whoever he was working for then like a slave, including getting whipped, he took that to the Plymouth County Court. I have those records somewhere. So, he took his case that he was a free man being treated like a slave and whipped, and he won his case.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, so Toby was a remarkable man. By that time, there were relatively few in the North who were born in Africa. At least second, third generation by roughly the 1790s, 1800s. The ones still coming in from Africa were going right to the South, at that time. And so, and you see this discussed in Alex Haley's Roots. The ones who were born in Africa and actually knew they were legitimate persons and not cattle or whatever they were treated like in America, and had experienced freedom as their original condition, were much more resistant to slavery than people who were born in second, third generation. Now, that's a generalization.
Sure.
Of course, many exceptions to that rule, but the people involved in the purchasing of slaves, people with big plantations that had been in existence for generations, hesitated to buy Africans on the ship. By the time, roughly, American Revolution and the next 20 to 30 years after that, they much preferred to buy human beings who were already broken and somewhat complacent, or not complacent isn't, I mean, ideologically and psychologically defeated,
Sure.
isolated.
Yeah.
They were born without hope, in other words,
Ugh.
whereas a person who had been born into freedom and forced into slavery, they were much more insistent on being free.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. Wow.
So Toby, I think that says something about Toby's character. If he was originally from somewhere in indigenous Africa, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to this Anna Keith Easton again because she brings this link into Minnesota here. So here's what I have on her, just a real quick summary. So she was married to this Isaac Keith. He dies in 1824. I mean, he was like 40 something at the time, so he died kind of young. She had 2 sons with him, and he was a white man. She was a white woman. Then she marries James Easton, the doctor. So James Easton Jr., who's a doctor. Now that's homeopathic. Do you know much about him?
Yeah, he dealt in herbal medicines, and so James Easton Jr., very interesting person. He traveled a lot, all around New England. First, he would travel for his family's iron business, selling tools in his younger years, and then he learned homeopathic medicine, or what they, I was looking at the records, they used to call that vegetable medicine. Plants, they knew the plants.
Yes.
Some of that must have been carried over indigenous knowledge because the Europeans weren't familiar with all the plants in America, so native people told them, this one's good for this is good for that. So he probably got that from his ancestors. And then as a abolitionist, James Easton Jr. Was often called upon to provide treatment to runaway slaves through on railroad connections there. So New Bedford, Massachusetts, where a lot of my relatives still live, was kind of a port of entry for people who had escaped slavery by ship. And Douglass came into Massachusetts through New Bedford. So first, Frederick Douglass, when he first escaped, went to New York, and then the abolitionists directed him to New Bedford because people of color could get jobs working in the shipyards there. And that's what Frederick Douglass did before he became a famous orator, the most popular and also the most photographed person in America in the 19th century.
So do you think the family knew Frederick Douglass then? I mean, you'd think so.
Some of my branch of the family knew him, and then the ones who spent a lot of time in Boston. Well, let's see. Here's what Douglass said about the Eastons. It is more like, I wish I would have known him. He knew many, like Hosea specifically he referred to, from reputation.
Okay.
Because he arrived in the free North in, I believe it was 1838 is when he escaped. So he first went to New York. He was in New Bedford by 1839, but by that time, all of those sons of James Easton, except for Caleb, who stayed on the farm and had a big family of his own. Though they were all dead by then. James Jr. being the last one to die. So James Jr. died the same year that Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery.
Yeah.
Or so they just missed each other. But my own relatives who lived in New Bedford attended at least his speeches. I don't know if any of them knew him personally. A lot of that has been lost to us as far as the information goes. But they are all involved in the same things. So James Jr., as a doctor, I have records showing that he was called upon to render aid and healing to runaway slaves who had been injured in their flight to freedom.
Interesting.
So, and so I have this record of one case like that, but the implication or the language or whatever the abolitionist woman who called upon him said, it was implied that she had often called upon him for that kind of reason. And this was one Underground Railroad activist of Massachusetts named Maria Weston Chapman, and her sister Deborah Weston were very, active people in the movement.
Okay. So this Dr. James Easton dies in 1838. You said Frederick Douglass arrives like 1839. I wonder where the sons Joshua and James are, because they don't come to Minnesota till 1857. Did you follow at all their movement?
Yeah, and those are some of the records I do have the 1850 census, though, that shows they and their mother Anna were still living at the Easton family compound or whatever, the very large piece of land they had in Brockton now. It's called North Bridgewater.
Okay.
Hold on, the census record right here, because it has Talbots on it. I wanted to tell you and see if you have the names of the Talbots that were with them. Because in their household, on their parcel of the Easton family land, you have Joshua, age 24, listed as head of household over his mom, Anna, who was 57 at the time. James H. Easton was 22. And with them was a young teenage gal named Martha Talbot, age 16, and a guy who was probably her younger brother, Isaac Talbot, age 13. Are those names of the Talbots in Minnesota?
Yeah, Isaac. I don't think Martha came, but Isaac is here, and he's here for a long time, and then he dies in South Dakota, but he spends almost his entire adulthood in Minnesota, and he ends up with like 3 or 4 different wives because they keep dying young. And he kind of hops around Olmsted County and Mower County, so he stays in the same area for a long, long time, which is kind of interesting. I wish there were photos of what these people looked like. I went to the History Center of Olmsted County, and I accessed the Easton. They had a file on them, and then they also had some photos that were in a photo collection. And I've got a picture now of the mother of Anna French Keith Easton, so I can send you all this stuff. And it's a photo from when she was pretty old. She looks like she's in her 70s. And then there's Lucy Jane Bolt, the wife of James Hiram Easton, who she was white, but there's a picture of her. And then their son, James and Lucy's son, Hamlet. James Hamlet. Yeah. And he became a singer. Like, I mean, he went to school, went to college, but he was known for his singing, and he performed a lot. And that was well noted in a bunch of letters and documents in the Rochester area. Like the Mayo brothers who founded Mayo Clinic, they went to school with him, and they knew him. And he was part of this elite group in Rochester, and he was known for his amazing tenor voice. So that's interesting. And somebody brought up to me recently how in a lot of the biracial abolitionist families, there's usually musical talent. Like, it just seems to be a common thread, the music piece of that. That's kind of interesting.
I'll tell you something else you just reminded me of. Benjamin Roberts, the school integrationist, was also a singer in a choir, like a quartet.
Huh.
And they did a show, this is sometime after the school integration battle had been won in Massachusetts, and his group was singing, and in the group also was his brother and sometime opponent, John H. Roberts, and one of the other people that were still in favor of keeping the black school. Yeah, they were all in the same singing group together.
Interesting.
But they fought. That's interesting how, singing and being musical and playing instruments was obviously part of the family routine there. And then that one guy going off to be a minstrel all the way to Australia.
Right?
Yeah.
Have you ever...
in
sorry.
church, they're very musical, too.
Sure. Have you ever come across any recordings of the one who became a minstrel? Like, was there any recordings ever made of his music?
Might have been kind of early for that. He died in, around 1890 over there in Australia.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
I'm not sure what kind of recordings would have been possible back in those days.
Yeah, right.
I don't know when that wax method of, I think it was more closer to 1900, close to the same time the first films were being made.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go back to this Anna Keith Easton one last time here. So she's married to this Keith guy. He dies. She has 2 white children with him. Then she marries Dr. James Easton, and she has 2 sons with him. And there's this, big push by the Keith family to take the Keith boys from her because they didn't want their grandsons in a biracial family, which is sad. So that's all documented. And then, so now that I know about her having this marriage to this guy who was actually married, but she didn't know that, it makes sense maybe why she came with her sons to Minnesota. I'm not sure, but they arrive in 1857, or at least they show up on that census. So Anna is here with her 2 boys, James and Joshua. And she's living with them that first census, but then by 1860, she's not living with them. She's living separate. She has purchased a farm, and there's a Talbot living with that. Isaac Talbot is living with her, I believe. I thought he showed up with her on a census here. So that's interesting. But she's only here a short time. Then she goes back to Massachusetts. Joshua and James, they're married, and then they kind of go their separate ways because Joshua ends up in somewhere south of here, not Missouri, somewhere and then Nebraska, I think.
Illinois is what I had.
Illinois, yes. Illinois, like Rock Island or something, and then he's out in Nebraska after that, I think.
I'll keep looking through my notes and find that. But anyway, it sounds like you know more than I do, though.
Well, I was curious.
About their,
Yeah, I was curious to talk with you because you know the pre-story before the family comes here and like all this generational civic engagement that really is going to impact these boys when they get here, or young men, you know. They've been exposed to this their whole lives. So to think that they would come to Minnesota and not be active is kind of like, well, that's, you know, they're growing up around this culture of civic engagement. So trying to then find how they might have been involved once they got to Minnesota. And there are little threads, there's little clues. You know, one thing we get interested in looking at too is there's all these rumors that have been handed down for generations of the Underground Railroad in our region, which I know sounds far-fetched, but when you look at the maps of where the known Underground Railroad ends in Iowa, it just stops, but these people are trying to get to Canada. It's like, well, we're missing a chunk there, right? Like how, granted they could get to the Mississippi River and then navigate other ways, but there's all these rumors in towns down here. So part of this is too like mapping out the abolitionists, the anti-slavery activists, and trying to figure out where there may have been possible connections and routes. So we don't have any primary sources saying the Underground Railroad was here. We don't have any, you know, I don't think we're going to ever find anything like that. But to at least be able to map out the anti-slavery, you know, activists. And so in 1869, I asked about Frederick Douglass because there was a, oh my gosh, I forget what they call it. It was like a colored convention. It had a different title than that. It was held in St. Paul, and the Eastons were up there. Well, James was, because Joshua was gone by then. James was up there, and he actually photographed Frederick Douglass. So it's funny when you mention Frederick Douglass being the most photographed person in, like, American history. James Easton supposedly took a picture of him. I'm trying to track it down. I came across that just a few weeks ago in an article I found online. And it would make sense because he's a photographer and they do have connections to anti-slavery, civic engagement, and potentially knew Frederick Douglass prior to his visit to Minnesota. So I'm on the lookout for that photo, if I can find that.
hey, I might have that.
Really? That would be amazing.
But there's a book done by an abolitionist historian that pretty well known. I've got the all the citation information, but it is basically a collection of the photographs of Frederick Douglass by this historian that actually is the one who discovered he was the most photographed American 19th century. And I don't know if there was anybody photographed more in the 20th century, but probably so because there's so much more photography, right?
Sure.
But anyway, definitely, and I think I did see a photograph of Douglas by J.H. Easton. I bookmarked it. I have it online. I got it as a, what do you call that? The thing that you can read books.
Oh, like
online.
a Kindle or something?
I have it as a Kindle book.
Okay.
But someday I may want to get it as a paper book because there's so many great photos.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, I'd forgotten that, and I remember now saying, how come he didn't take any photos of the other Eastons?
Right.
You know, I really wanted to have more photos of the Eastons in my book, and after I finally got it published, one of the descendants of Benjamin Roberts sent me a remarkable picture, just a beautiful portrait of him at around the age of 50-something. And I was just like, thank you so much. I wish he could have got in touch about a year earlier before I published this. And anyway, I do have that photograph now. edition.
Right.
That'll be like on the cover with all those other images. I got the banjo playing guy on the cover and inside the book.
Oh, nice. So what's the title of your book again?
Oh, it's the Eastons. Okay, let me. I'm so bad with names. Even of my own.
That's okay. I have it here too. I just got to pull it up. My computer's being slow. It's got a long title, I know.
Oh, well, it's in that link I sent you.
The Eastons, 5 Generations of Human Rights Activism, 1748 to 1935, by George R. Price.
That's it. That's the title.
There's a lot of photos on the cover of it.
Yeah, I like having photos. I wish I had more. And so I wanted, during my whole, what's it been now, nearly 40 years of researching these folks, I just yearned for more photos of them. And the one I had the most photos of was my own great-grandfather, who was also a civil rights activist. Anyway, the guy in the last chapter of the book, he lived from 1861 to 1935. Anyway, I had plenty of photos of him and the family, but we didn't have too much of any before that. I've got a picture of his mother that my relatives in New Bedford found hidden behind a board in the wall.
Oh, wow.
Of their, because they live in the same house that was built in the 1890s here in Massachusetts. And so, my relatives were able to give me some things, but no photos of those old timers. And I know that in the 1840s, when photography first hit the U.S., the daguerreotypes came in 1840, and the photo studios just started springing up everywhere. And one way they would drum up business was to find a person of color, usually off the streets, a dock worker or somebody, bring them into the studio, put a fancy coat and top hat on them, and take a real nice portrait, put it in their window, and have some kind of advertisement saying, and we did this remarkable portrait of a colored man. Couldn't we do much better for you?
Oh, jeepers. Oh, man.
Potential white customer,
Yeah.
And so, because they did that, the Smithsonian Institute or was it the National Archives in Washington, D.C., has a big collection of these photos. Vast majority of them unidentified.
Yeah.
Now, there could be Eastons among those photos, but the ones that they did identify have been reprinted in other sources by anthropologists and people like that, and our own tribal members, because they found their ancestors there. So I've seen those that set of old studio photographs, and I might have actually been looking at one of my ancestors, but it was unidentified.
Right. Well, that's one thing with AI technology, which is, scary, but those are the kinds of things it could be useful for, because if you can find a photo and you say, okay, I know this is Joshua Easton in this photo, it will scan it and then it will look through other photos to try to match the features. So who knows?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
do you?
That's interesting.
Yeah. Do you know of any diaries, journals, things like that, that any of the Eastons of that Dr. James Easton era kept that are archived in places?
Oh gosh, I wish I did have something like that. Well, I do have letters between them, and I cited a couple of those in my book. There's one real poignant letter from Sarah Easton in her old age to the church, the second church that they had protest at, and she was invited to come back to the church. And after James died, this was shortly after 1830, and she wrote this really powerful letter about why she wouldn't go back there, and about the treatment that they had been given. And the abolitionist, famous gal, Lydia Maria Child, published the letter in one of her books.
Oh, wow.
And I include the entire piece in the appendix of my book.
Okay.
There, it's so striking. And that's one, and a letter from James Jr. to Captain Paul Cuffey. Have you heard of him?
No.
So yeah, he was another really famous, significant American sea captain who was, his mother was Wampanoag and his dad was from Africa. And so we had a couple marriages between the Cuffeys and the Eastons. And Cuffey was a real significant figure in that, like James Fortin, I told you about, the rich Philadelphia black guy who was actually wealthy from the sail-making business. They made sails at his shop for all the ships back when all the ships had sails.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Cuffey probably bought some of his sails. He built his own ships, sailed all over the world as a merchant captain. And, and this was this was before anyway, Cuffey lived till 1817. He had an audience with James Madison before the War of 1812. That's what I was trying to say. Yeah, because Madison had expressed earlier the idea of sending free, formerly enslaved Africans in America back to Africa. And he actually agreed with that idea for anybody who willingly wanted to go to Africa. They were fed up with American racism. And Cuffey offered to take African Americans who were either from Africa or wanted to go there back. And he talked to James Madison about it. And I think it was right at the outbreak of the War of 1812. And Madison basically said, I like your idea, but we can't fund it because our hands are tied with fighting off the British. I imagine it was the war either just broken out or they anticipated it, and so I got that in my notes. And so James Easton Jr. wrote a letter to Captain Cuffey, and I have that. It was when was that? It had to have been immaculate in writing. His mom was an excellent writer by 1830, 31 or whatever that was. But so I didn't republish James's letter. I described it and mentioned some of the things, but it was so embarrassing. All the misspellings and funny phraseology there.
Yeah.
But that was typical, because you got to realize most Americans were not literate until the mandatory public school movement of the 1820s. It kind of begins there and goes further after that. But people, if they got literacy, it was often through their churches, where they wanted people to read the Bible. But when they wrote, people in America generally, and probably the rest of the world. Oh, there's a lot of places in Europe even where literacy wasn't common till mid-19th century for the working class.
Sure.
People.
How do you spell that Captain Paul? How did you say his last name? Cuddy? I didn't hear how you.
Cuffe.
Okay.
And he ended up, after James wrote to him, giving a very sizable loan to James Easton Sr. to help him pay off his debts. And he did the loan with part of James's land as collateral. And it was $2,000, which in, 1812 or 10 would have been like, what would you say? Or this was 1815, shortly before he died. Hey, $2,000, I have it written down, because there's a tool online where you can translate the value of the dollar.
Oh, wow.
Over. Yeah, it's called measuring worth. So any dollar amount you want to feed into this tool will tell you what it was worth in a given, and what that amount is worth today. Well, any amount, what it's worth today, but you want to find out what it was in the 1820s,
Right, yeah. Well, that's a cool tool.
So I think I found out that $2,000 then was close to like 150,000 today, something like that. Yeah, big loan.
Yeah.
He was pretty well off. And those kind of stories are very important and useful for fighting racism, because America tends to imagine that all people of color or all African-descended people were enslaved, which is not true.
Right.
Before the Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
and then sent them all free. But actually, I have the statistics. I used to know them right off the top of my head. But anyway, that wasn't true. And the other generalization is that the vast majority of Afro-descended people are poor, and always have been since they became free. And to know of these successful business persons, even back in the 1700s, and 1800s, is a real kind of shock to a lot of people.
Right. So the one last question here, and then we can wrap it up. But at the very beginning, before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about the Jeffrey family, because the Jeffrey and the Easton families kind of overlap in like the region that they originate from, where they were living. So I don't know what you want to share about the Jeffrey family and the connection to the Easton. I don't know if you found a whole lot of connection.
No, I'd like to know more about the Jeffreys. I have a picture, a photograph of one of them from about 1890 or so. The one who still lived in Massachusetts. I'm looking at my phone's battery indicator, and I'm about to.
It's gonna die.
So I better go pretty quick. If I suddenly disappear, you know why.
Okay.
I hope not. But the Jeffreys were Wampanoags and African, as most New England natives are. I found them in several records last night. I hadn't really thought much about them being connected to the Eastons until you told me that. I knew they lived in the same communities, but I didn't have any records, say, of intermarriages with them.
Right.
Like that, but I'm just going to scan real quickly.
Yeah, no problem. It's just so coincidental that they both end up in Winona County, literally like 30 miles from each other, once they get here.
Yeah, I'm sure they knew each other in Massachusetts, and a lot of families went out west together.
Sure.
The extended families like that.
And the Jeffries family, I interviewed a descendant of theirs a few years back, and he had some interesting stories, but they have a Frederick Douglass connection too. So I guess it's not surprising if they're involved in anti-slavery work.
Yeah, Douglass was in high demand, and he sure got around. Yeah, I may have to send this to you. I'm going to send you, I'll scan it, or I actually already have it in my computer as a scanned image. That 1850 census that showed Anna and her sons living with all the Eastons. And gosh, I'm looking at it right now. It must be about 17 or 18 people all on that land in their separate houses. Yeah. So, I'll send you that. And included in their household, besides the Talbot kids, who I imagine she had adopted or taken in, they probably were orphaned.
Sure.
As was the case, a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old. They also had an Irish immigrant named Quinlan O'Neill, 20-year-old laborer from Ireland.
Interesting.
Living in there. This is, I could go on and on, but this is another often untold story is the Irish immigrants in the 1830s and 40s who come into Massachusetts in droves, and also New York and a few other places. They were not, immediately racist towards black folks. It was actually the opposite. They were, for one thing, forced into the same neighborhoods, doing the same kind of work, either unloading ships, in the docks, or as house servants to the wealthy, maids and butlers. And when I looked through just the 1850 census of Boston, I saw many cases of intermarriage between Irish maids and African American butlers. Yeah, in Boston in the 1850s. So, they had to, like every other European immigrant group, they had to learn racism. after they came over here,
Sure.
you know. And they had to learn that was the way to get along with the ruling class in America. You know, if you wanted promotion, whatever, in society, don't start mixing and mingling with the black folks. You know, and that's an old story that a lot of us are more aware of than other Americans are. But that apparently was the case with them. You know, this whole Easton family compound. They also had a gal who married an Englishman and came to live with him. Kind of an English of the upper class, apparently, and lived there. And one of the Easton gals married him. That's on the next census, the 1861, and I'll have to find that.
I'll have to dig around a little bit more in the family trees to see if I can find any intermarriage between the Jeffreys and the Eastons, because I've never really dug that far to look at that. Like, that just occurred to me recently. Like, I wonder if somehow they're related or intermarried.
Well, I've looked through many, probably close to all of the Massachusetts marriage records and didn't find that particular combination. But the other thing is, in the earlier days especially, the common law marriages were frequent, and the unrecorded, undocumented people were, you know, people who kind of stayed on the farm, didn't go anywhere, didn't trust the officials, didn't want to go into courts, and some of them didn't want to go into churches either.
Sure.
So they didn't get married. If they did get married, it wasn't in a church or a court or any kind of official documentation. You know, you might find them listed together in property records.
Yeah.
And death records. So even though common law or just cohabiting relations were illegal in Massachusetts Bay Colony, that, you know, being illegal doesn't stop people. Just turns them into outlaws.
Right.
In a lot of cases.
Yeah. So for the last kind of closing here, as long as your battery holds out, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
What are the thoughts on the role that your family, then, the Eastons, played in the anti-slavery movement, like bringing an end to slavery? How do you feel about this history? Why is it important to preserve?
Well, you know, I think they were, you know, not at the top of the movement like Frederick Douglass or the other people. I think Hosea Easton was probably the best known. And then Benjamin Roberts, his nephew. So as far as being well known, those two. But there were so many abolitionist activists whose stories never saw the light of day, except maybe in obscure abolitionist newspapers or in the transcripts of speeches given at meetings.
Sure.
That would be one place, like at the conventions of the free people of color. Mm-hmm. Then you could. So what I'll say is that, and one of the points of my book is that this legacy seemed to carry on, you know, back from fighting for their Indian lands in the 1750s to my great-grandfather's death in 1935. You see this thread of conscious social responsibility, mainly for equal rights and equality and that kind of thing. And also a strong belief in education. Mm-hmm. And some of the individuals in our family were teachers too, which is probably one of the elements that carried over to me eventually. So anyway, it was really good talking to you. Not only is my battery going dead, but my voice is...
Right? And it's lunchtime, so yeah, I appreciate it. I will send you a copy of the transcript. It might take me a month to get that typed up. It's going to be a long one, but and then I'll put together all the information I have on the family here, and I'll share that with you as well. So have a great rest of your day. I appreciate all your time.
Yeah, well, I'm retired and I like doing this kind of thing. So thank you for getting in touch with me, and I'm sure we will continue to communicate, and I look forward to that.
For sure. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.